Hello. Well, where to start? It will be very different from the other talks. I won't talk that much about data and data curation. I will talk about, although it's the topic of the talk as well, we have started building a bibliography of translation of Czech literature, and this seems to be a very difficult task. And we thought we would use OCLC databases and other databases together with the data and clean it and all that stuff, and it would be wonderful. It turned out impossible. Some of the reasons are, the FRBR model is not observed altogether, and so especially when it comes to works, it is not possible to actually identify them. And so there have been quite a lot of problems. So we thought how to build a new bibliography of translations. And when you look at it from the researcher's point of view, and this is what I would like to do today, is researchers in translation studies, and that's my background, very often, whatever study they start doing in literary translation, they start with actually compiling a bibliography of translation in some way. And then they leave the bibliography in the dissertation or in the study, and it's there. And we thought it would be great actually to crowdsource these so that we provide them with a manual how to build that bibliography, and we provide them with some kind of service, and then we actually harvest it and use it for our bibliography so that we build it up. One of the reasons why building translation bibliographies is very difficult is they're so multilingual. Suddenly, there are languages that you can't even read, not to talk about understanding, and there might be very few items in the languages that you are actually interested in. So suddenly you need experts in all those languages, and if someone does already that work, so we thought we might use it. But to build a bibliography or translation studies, translation bibliography that would be useful for researchers, that also entails actually understanding what the researchers want to do with it. So I would like to start here now with an outline. This is the outline with kind of look into where global literary studies and world literary studies go and what concepts they use, so that we can understand what information we actually should collect in the bibliographies and how we should structure these bibliographies, and whether the models that we have at hand might be useful in some way or not, or whether we have to tweak them so that they actually will be useful for these scholars. And when I talk about these scholars, I don't mean those scholars that are very well versed in data, so no computer literary studies, but usually, very traditional scholars that look into texts and perhaps some mixed methods and all that stuff, but not primarily those that are very well versed in data science. So to start with, I looked at several books that have been published recently over the past 20 years, and there are some of them, and looked at the concepts that are around there in all of them, and see whether we can provide them with some information, or what type of information might be useful if they want to deal with these concepts that have been around in literary studies from a global perspective. So one of those concepts is space. And of course, time. There is this understanding that the literary world is decentered, dynamic, characterized by multiple spaces where cultural flows of goods circulate in different directions through different channels. And of course, this includes some zones of contact and some zones of conflict. And the researchers try to map these zones, try to see where actually these conflicts might be. So the space and geographic locations seem to be very, very important there. And of course, when we talk about different channels, this also includes modality and remediation, where actually literary works might turn into movies, into computer games, and so on. So mapping all these suddenly becomes very important for them, so that they can actually see which channels might become more important than the others in which zones. So that's one of the concepts. Another concept that has become very, very prominent recently is connectivity, where researchers try to study movements or either physical, intellectual networks, connectivity, intersection, and the resulting effects of these connections. And there is a process of identification of circuits of connectivity, why something happens at the same time together with, or why similar people actually make similar decisions, and they can be at the same place or they can be distributed other places. And they can be based, these similarities may be based on subjects, they can be based on audiences. Some publishers might focus on children's literature, so there is a circuit of connectivity based on what we do in children's literature and how we study children's literature. Some others might be interested in some historical subject, and suddenly you can see that, for instance, in the Netherlands, there is quite high interest in Holocaust, and quite a lot of literature, and everything that is going on there is actually, if they translate anything, it's very often on Holocaust. So there is suddenly this subject-defined circuit of connectivity, and researchers try to understand why this is happening. And if you look, for instance, in the other direction, what is being translated from the Dutch literature, suddenly you can see that it's children's literature, and you can ask questions why this is happening. And of course, these are some of the connections are physical that people really meet, and some of them, as I've been suggesting, are more kind of abstract when there is the subject that might be interesting. And of course, when we talk about connectivity, there is also disconnections. So it concerns kind of mapping where the disconnections are, and some of them might be political because there might be some kind of censorship or other kinds. So we are talking about subjects, we are talking about places, we are talking about people there. Another thing that is happening quite a lot now is focus on the scale and integration of different scales, where you map literature that is going on locally, nationally, regionally, but also globally. And then on different types of scales, do we focus on books? Do we focus on particular documents or a lot of books together? What we have seen a lot of research going on now is in periodicals and translations in periodicals, especially in the 19th century. This is very important. But also if you look at what is going on in terms of understanding the global divide, then it is very important to focus on translations in periodicals, because you can see that in Latin America or in India, translations in periodicals are much more prominent than in books. So if you only count for books, then you might miss out quite a lot of that is going on there. So there is this very big push to actually include all these types of materials and formats into the research. And lastly, the last concept that I would like to focus on is agency, that has been around for quite some time, where there is kind of focused on analysis of agents of very different kinds. These can be writers, translators, but also if you turn actually the literary works or any other works into movies, then all the people that are actually connected to it, or computer games. So how actually this kind of agency plays in, and how to map and understand how people make the decisions and what they actually do. And then this is, of course, connected with the subject of space and how people are actually distributed in space. And we talk about these agency-filled zones of mediation which generate, articulates, and navigates geopolitical and plurilingual dynamics. So we talk about all these people that kind of are in the space and understand the space in some kind, and we want to see, can we in translation and in the data that we get about translation understand what is going on, why the decisions are being made. And of course, in terms of agency, there is also this subject, this topic of remediation, or which people actually take part in that. So from these kind of very brief overview of these concepts, you can have some kind of idea, or you can try to imagine how would you actually compose a bibliographical record if you would like to actually make it possible for the researchers to use it in the way they might use it. I will show a small case study that might give you a better idea. This will be about Stephanie Kreml's dissertation that should be submitted in 2 or 3 weeks, so it's very fresh, on the transculturality of the Communist Manifesto, and it's a case study of compiling and using a bibliography of translations in global literary research at a micro scale. So she's focusing on one particular document and tries to understand how it was spreading throughout the world, globally, throughout almost 2 centuries now. And when I talked to her, this is very interesting. She talks about tracking the biography of translations, or Lebenslauf der Übersetzung, how and in what way does it get republished, recycled, cited, used covertly and openly. So you can see that republishing, so different editions, recycling, how it gets recycled, where it gets published. So all this actually gets mapped, but also citations. So we are interested actually in the reception and how to map reception into it, and how it is, of course, used covertly. So she uses also letters and other documentation that might be attached to it, and distinguishes between translation event as such, the first publication of translation or non-publication, and later republications. So then you can suddenly see what kind of information you might want to actually have in the bibliographical record, if you're interested. She collected first language editions. There were 54 from 1848, the publication of the German original edition and the first Swedish translation, to 71, the translation into Swahili. And she looks into the global geographical dissemination and says, due to migration, persecution, censorship, first language editions regularly don't appear where the language is widely spoken, but in cities central to the movement. So here you can very clearly see how space actually is understood, and how the connectivity plays in, and how agency and movement, all this plays in, and she tries to understand and map all this. When I talked to her and asked about the publishing format she considered, and when she found actually all this information, so it was newspaper articles, because most of the publications, or many of the translations, are serialized in newspapers. Then, of course, brochures and books, where she needs to make distinctions to be made between separate publications of the Communist Manifesto and anthologies, or correctly it works, where the Communist Manifesto is only a chapter or part of a book. And, of course, unpublished translations, which can be found in archives, and then what she calls zero translations. When a translation is mentioned somewhere, so in letters or so we know about the translation, but there is actually no proof of it, because it has never been published, or you can't find it in the archive. So all this kind of information, when a researcher starts to build a bibliography, all these kinds of information suddenly plays in. And if we want to recover that from any catalog, library catalog, this is impossible, because most of that, it won't be there. First of all, most of the library catalogs are books only, so there is the level of articles won't be there. Second, if there are anthologies and collected works, very often you wouldn't actually understand what's inside. And of course, there wouldn't be no information on unpublished translations, let alone these zero translations. So how to actually build a bibliography that include all of this? And there's some fancy visualizations showing the relay translations, and of course, kind of the timeline that shows which translations, color-coded, which translations actually originate from which languages. So that's kind of trying to map retranslations and relay translations over time and the publishing. And then if we then have a look from this perspective onto the library reference model, and I will refer to the library reference model rather than to FRBR. That, of course, includes, as has been mentioned here, the 3 different requirements. then we can actually see here, and this is the model, we can see here that FRBR is actually still there. It's not, they have not overworked altogether. They have just included some other areas into it, which is, of course, very helpful, but the concepts that were in the previous in FRBR, they are still there. What is also very nice, what is definitely very nice and very useful from our perspective, that the time span has been more included. Of course, agency is much better covered, and also the relationship between the individual items are much better covered there. But what we still do have there, with the item of work, the concept of work is still the same. So work is either a novel or a play or a poem or essay or symphony or photograph or anything else. It can be a film, but there is no general idea of an abstract work that actually might cover the idea of remediation or recycling. If I have a work that was originally published as a play and or a novel, and then it's transferred to a computer game, these suddenly become two different works, but we actually, or from the translation studies point of view or literary studies point of view, these are actually the same work, and I want to actually connect them together. So there is this definitely is still missing there, and we need to somehow to cater for that. And of course, the relationships are very, very nice, but many, as they say, many relationships are defined at a general level with the intention that implementations would define the pertinent refinements. So there is quite a lot of room for kind of improvisation. So if we seek for some kind of consistency, that it's very difficult actually to apply the model. So I try to compile some general, very general translation bibliography requirements, or if you want some concepts that should be applied if such a bibliography should be useful to translation study scholars or literary study scholars that focus on the global perspective. And one of them is that it needs to be an analytical bibliography. It needs to go beyond books, because otherwise we lose quite a lot of information. And perhaps for some countries, most of information is actually not there at all. This includes, of course, this is very important for the global perspective and the publishing diversity. The publishing venues are very, very different from country to country. And so we need to kind of incorporate all these venues where books or translations might be published, or either electronically or any other formats. We need to include more agency. Very often, very many agents are missing. Even if we looked into OCLC catalogues for how often translators are mentioned in translations, where we actually are able to identify the books or translations and look into the percentage of how often translators are mentioned, it's about 15%. So 85% of books that are translations do not carry the information on translators. Of course, this might often be the case that in the book, the translation was not mentioned, but still the percentage is very low. So all this agency actually needs to be included in it. Then we need to focus on the quality of relationships. Very often in the models, there is stated that there is a relationship and we make a link, but we need to actually focus on what type of the relationship is, especially if we focus on derivations and remediation of that type. You have a source text, and suddenly you want to actually know, is that derivative text a translation, or is it a partial translation, or is it just some kind of, did they make a comic book of it, or anything else? So that mapping that quality of the relationship from book to book is, or from translation or original to translation, is very, very important there. And then what I've been talking about, we need some kind of meta work entity, that where we can actually have an abstract idea of a work that actually includes all the type of works that are included in FRBR. So both books, films, and other types that might come around. And on top of that, as researchers very often not just focus on translations themselves, but also on the reception, it would be great to have it actually linked to reception. When we have a database here on reception, it's great to have actually the individual works on the work level linked to the reception, both for the individual meta works or the parts that are included in it. If you have, for instance, different cyclic poems that you are interested in, it would be great to have actually all those listed and have individual authorities created for them so they can find them. Yes, and that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ondřej, and obligatory questions. Yeah, Matteo, please.
About that last slide, when you underscore the need for a meta-work entity, that's not something that could be fulfilled by the links between different works?
What we have created is a persistent identifier and an abstract work that is actually linked to that's actually the practical way of doing it, that we have been thinking about creating an entity as soon as a work gets actually another work that is connected to it. So if for instance, a theater play turns into opera, they are able to create another entity that would include both of these and linked by identifiers. So that's the practical way of doing it.
But could you, instead of doing this, say that the play is derived from, the game is derived from the play via a relationship, avoiding another entity? That would be an alternative way of achieving the same thing.
Well, it can't be traced in the current models. Well, in the current models, these are two separate works, and you would have to look, and if the name is not the same, then there is no way of doing it in the current models.
You will need a relationship.
You need a relationship. You need a relationship. You need an identifier that actually will connect these. Otherwise, in current models, these are two separate entities, not connecting by anything except for the author, perhaps.
I have a question and a remark. The remark is, FRBR model was proposed 25 years ago. And 2022, the majority of the catalogs have not yet implemented FRBR. And basically what we are saying is, what happens when the translation changes? What happens with full text? What happens with metaworks? So we're making FRBR more and more complex. So we're making the task more and more complex, and I have a feeling that the library is like, we are requiring more and more, but we see little improvement in, the task is becoming so incredibly complex, and since 25 years ago, it has been so little done that, we can make the model more and more complex, and perhaps we have to wait like 50 years till things. I don't know.
Well, from the point of view of libraries, definitely it's getting more and more complex and more messy. But from the point of view, when you start building a bibliography, it's not all that difficult. Because, you think about the concepts as they are abstract concepts. But for instance, when you are talking about, mapping the individual entities, you don't need, for individual manifestation to have actually an identifier for each of them. You know that there is some kind of entity, but actually what the researchers are interested in is not the existence of this entity, but the information in it and the connection between the actually entities, right? And usually it's just the latest manifestation that those that are interested in are actually those who are doing research in literature are interested in. So it's not the item, it's the manifestation that they're interested in. And the abstract model is there. And if you want to kind of have identifiers for each of them, okay, I don't think it's needed. I think most of the FRBR model, here have you expressions, what you don't need it. it's an abstract model, but in terms of actually creating a bibliography, okay, there is some extra information and there is a general idea, but from a researcher's point of view, it's not that relevant. So yeah, what is more relevant is actually this meta work that will connect the individual works as librarians understand it together.
And actually, my question is about this concept of meta work. And my question is, how do you define it? How do you, let's say if I write a new novel where Superman makes something in the Middle Earth with the Twilight people. What are because at the end of the day, a work is, the main feature of a work is the agent, the author. So when you can mix different, the agent and the form, but when you don't have specific person to relate this meta work, how do you actually define this is a meta work?
Well, you can definitely, in some cases it can be very difficult, but in practical world, there are very few of these cases that are very difficult. Very often the researchers will be actually able to identify very easily. If you have a Sapkowski novel and then a computer game based on Sapkowski's novel, then it's obvious.
Yeah, the computer game may be based on it, or maybe quite.
It's a
it gets the idea, but it's something different. So, where is the degree to which you can say this is the same method work?
Well, I think this can be actually quite broad, because from the researcher's point of view, it's more important to understand the breadth of it, how far you can actually get from the original work, and then how precise it needs to be.
Then you go back to what was previously said. I mean, instead of having the meta work there, you have the relations that will give you this network.
But in the current models, there are no relations. They are not there. Yeah, they are not there. So you need to create it, and this is a way of creating the relationships.
Okay.